For many centuries, London was a dangerous place. It was a magnet for the very worst kind of people. Jack the Ripper dominated the headlines. But he wasn't the only killer around. Murder was afoot. The fear of death was everywhere. But police had their work cut out to track the culprits down. In this series, we'll be investigating some of the country's most notorious and intriguing crimes.
The female defendant.
Sexual intrigue, vicious murder, as well as the latest technology, fed the nation's insatiable desire for gruesome stories of London's dark side. Brighton in summer is a popular spot and has been so for centuries. In the Georgian era, it was a stylish retreat of the rich and famous. Later in the 19th century, the advance of the railways opened up the seaside town. People from all walks of life journeyed there for its fresh air and long sunny days. By the 1930s, Brighton was an easy and popular day trip from London. But if that modern train line brought tourists to the town, it also brought those with a darker purpose.
Brighton's always been a rather raffish place, even since the days of the Prince Regent and general naughtiness in the early 19th century. The elegant terraces, expensive hotels, rich people, and yet behind it there's a substratum of prostitution and crime.
Brighton was a very thrusting, energetic sort of town. It was a bit, I suppose, like a comprehensive school, with the wealthy at one end, the very wealthy, and the low life at the other end. You know, it had such a mixed population, such a cosmopolitan place.
It was exciting and vibrant, a little bit edgy and a little bit violent at times, and so I think it attracted people there that believed that things were going to happen. It was close enough to London to attract some of the worst elements of criminals to go down there to see what they could do at Brighton.
The criminal underworld thrived off the close connections with London. Razor-wielding gangs fought for supremacy. The town was plagued by racketeering and extortion, gambling and prostitution. But murder was the crime that the town became most famous for. It was murder that in this decade gave Brighton its unwanted nickname, Queen of the Slaughtering Places.
June 1934 was a very, very hot month, and people flocked down to Brighton in huge numbers, and everybody seemed to be enjoying themselves at that time, except in the railway station at Brighton.
A station porter had alerted the police to a foul-smelling trunk, the contents of which would shock the nation. Inside the trunk, wrapped in layers of cheap brown paper and packed around with cotton wool, was a parcel. It was secured with a long length of sash cord. The police untied it and opened it. Inside was the dismembered torso of a young woman. Recognizing the severity of the crime, the Chief Constable of Brighton Police requested assistance from London.
It was usual at that time for provincial forces to call in the Yard because the Yard had the expertise and the resources to help in inquiries. It should also be added that liaison between various police forces wasn't very good at that time, so it's a good idea to have officers down from London who might also know likely lads or lasses who were involved in crime in Brighton.
That evening, just hours after the discovery of the torso, Chief Inspector Robert Donaldson and Detective Sergeant Edward Sorrell arrived in Brighton to take charge of the investigation.
The trunk was left at the station on the 6th of June, Derby Day, racing fans. According to the tag number, staff estimate it was deposited there between 6 and 7 p.m. Obviously, we're going to be questioning everyone who was on duty at that time.
More than 90 pieces of luggage were left in the cloakroom on that day alone, gentlemen. It will be difficult for staff to remember individuals, so we will have to jog their memories.
The trunk was a common make, but it was new. It would also have been heavy. It may have taken 2 people to carry, so an employee, a porter, might have even helped the suspect with it.
This will not be an easy case. As it stands, we do not have much to work with, but if we are thorough, and if we are precise, gentlemen, I do believe we will apprehend those responsible for this.
Who was the killer? And who was the victim? And where was the rest of her? There were few clues. There were no identifying marks on the body and no fingerprints on the suitcase. The one lead police had was a fragment of handwriting found on the paper wrapped around the body. A single word, written in blue pencil, could just be made out. Ford.
So, they found the legs.
As in Brighton, staff at King's Cross Station in London had become alarmed by a rancid smell in the luggage room. Finally, on the evening of the 18th of June, they discovered the source of the stench: the brown trunk. It had been left there on the 7th of June, one day after the first trunk had been deposited in Brighton. Inside this second case, neatly wrapped in oil-soaked paper, were the rotting legs and feet of a young woman. Once again, station staff had no clear memory or record of who had left the trunk, and its contents offered few clues either. An alert was sent out to stations across the country. Left luggage rooms were searched up and down the land. But there was no sign of the body's head or arms anywhere.
People would send trunks full of luggage on the railways quite regularly. So there were a lot of these trunks about, and it seemed at one stage as though there were an awful lot of trunks with dead bodies inside them.
Luckily, most murderers are amateurs at it, and most of them don't seem to realise how difficult it is to dispose of a body. So you've got to find somewhere to put it, or cut it up, or do something of that sort. So yes, trunks, murder, suitcases, you name it. They seem to come up fairly regularly.
The torso and legs were examined by Home Office pathologist Sir Bernard Spilsbury. By this time, Spilsbury was a legend. His evidence had proved decisive in securing the convictions of Dr. Crippen in 1910 and the brides in the Bath murderer George Smith in 1915. 2 decades later, he was still the most renowned and respected pathologist in the country.
Sir Bernard's report, sir. King's Cross legs are a match.
she was pregnant.
4 to 5 months. Could be why she was killed.
Perhaps so.
Otherwise, she was in good health. No natural cause of death detected.
The condition of the feet and toenails suggests she was particular in matters of personal hygiene.
I thought she could have been a dancer, sir.
Have you ever seen a dancer's feet, Sergeant?
No.
Well, they aren't pretty.
When have you seen a dancer's feet, sir?
Dismemberment occurred several hours at least after death. The press are going to love this.
Donaldson was right. Almost 50 representatives of local and national newspapers descended on Brighton. They loitered outside the police station day and night, eager for any scrap of information they could sensationalize for their readers. But such scraps were thin on the ground. The dead woman's identity was still unknown. How she died and where was another mystery. As yet, Inspector Donaldson was no closer to finding answers or the killer. Little did he know, however, that his whole investigation was about to be turned on its head. The case, which would become known as the Brighton trunk murders, was quickly gaining notoriety. But the police investigation had few clues to go on. With no way to identify the victim or killer, the police turned to the public. They did not disappoint. Donaldson and his team were soon overwhelmed by an avalanche of tip-offs. A card index with 13 different categories was needed just to cope. In New Kent Road, London, Annie Watts read the news reports with mounting alarm. She had not seen her 42-year-old daughter Violet in 3 years and feared the worst. Hers was but one tip among thousands. 800 missing women had been reported to the police. Donaldson and his team had to check every one. But among the 70 who were not found was Mrs. Watts' daughter. Born in 1891, Violet was a music hall artist. But singing and dancing in cheap venues for pennies was a difficult way to make a living. Often she relied on prostitution to get by.
Violet Saunders was from a family of 9. She eventually became part of a song and dance duo. She didn't exactly play the Palladium, it was something more like the Balham Hippodrome. Her partnership broke up in 1927. She took up with another man under the title of K&K. That lasted until the early 30s, but then they parted company, partly, I think, because she'd taken to the bottle a bit, and also perhaps was experimenting with drugs.
By 1933, she was going by the stage name of Violet Kay. It was in this year that she met a man calling himself Tony Mancini. He was more than a decade younger than her, but he had a quick smile and keen charms. In September that year, she asked him to come to Brighton with her. Mancini agreed.
She conceived a passion for Mancini, and she wanted him to move away from the violence of London down to Brighton. And for some months, Mancini lived off her earnings. They had a basement flat in Park Crescent, and when customers came calling, Mancini would go away and then return later on and pick up the money from Violet, which she was happy to give him. But she was also incredibly jealous.
Violet was too old to be the dead woman found at the train stations, but police were in no position to dismiss a lead. Weeks had passed, and they were no closer to finding the killer. When word reached them that Mancini had been witnessed disposing of women's clothing, Inspector Donaldson decided to bring him in.
Mancini. That's an Italian name, isn't it?
It is, sir, yes.
I don't hear much of an accent.
Where was it you were born, Mr. Mancini?
London. I'm a London boy. They all know me up there.
Sergeant Sorrell and I are from the Metropolitan Police. Would we know you?
Not Brighton boys, then?
Scotland Yard.
Should have known they'd send the professionals for me.
Look, I'll tell you the truth. That's why you're here.
It's just a name. Mancini. I made it up.
Tony Mancini is not your name.
Cecil England. Louis. Cecil Louis England. You get all that?
Cecil Louis England.
Write down I'm telling the truth as well.
Why Mancini?
Now, geezer can call himself what he wants, can't he?
That rather depends on the reason.
Never liked Cecil.
Tony Mancini, his real name was Cecil England, but he also used the surname Notire. He took the name Tony Mancini because there was a girl he knew, and she liked the men to be Italian, and so Mancini thought this was a great name, so he became Tony Mancini. He also was known as Tony English and Hyman Gold.
He was born on the 7th of January 1908 in New Cross, a working-class district of southeast London. Aged 18, he joined the Royal Air Force and served for 2 years before leaving with the rank of aircraftman first class.
Tony Mancini was a low-level criminal. He was in the Air Force for 2 years. He had either deserted or he'd been invited to leave the service. And he'd been a bit of a fairground boxer, but in the main he wasn't doing much work.
Just 20, he headed back to London. There he found occasional work as a barman in Knightsbridge or a hawker in the West End. But he was always short of money. In 1930, he was convicted for theft.
He was convicted of stealing silver and then of loitering with intent to commit a felony, and eventually of stealing from a dwelling house, for which he got 6 months. He'd had 3 months for the loitering. He was released around about 1932 and made his way to the West End.
On his release, he began work at a club near Leicester Square in the heart of London. He told co-workers there his name was Tony Mancini. It was at this club that he met Violet Kay.
Are you acquainted with a woman named Violet Kay?
You mean, do I know her?
Yes.
I know her, sir. I did. She were my missus till she left.
Where did she go?
I come home from work and find this letter saying she's leaving, going off with some other geezer, someone who can keep her better.
What was his name?
I didn't see it coming. Her leaving me. You know, I used to play for Queen's Park Rangers.
What was her new man's name?
Well, she didn't say. From what I've heard since, it was this Moore geezer. He had a bookmaker's office on Gloucester Road. Don't know where he is now.
When was this?
May?
When in May?
Well, I've been at the Skylark about a week, so 14th, something like that. Yeah, I come home from work and she were gone. Ungrateful cat.
Mr. Mancini.
England. Cecil Louis.
Mr. England. Can you tell us your whereabouts on Wednesday, the 6th of June this year?
It was Derby Day.
Yeah. I remember. Windsor lad. Had a nice little wager on him.
6th of June, where were you?
Work. Yeah. All day.
Until what time?
9:30. We're open pretty late.
And on the 7th?
Same. I work every day. You can ask them, they all know me in there.
Police kept watch as Mancini returned to the seaside cafe where he worked. He seemed unalarmed. After an afternoon serving food and drink to customers, he joined friends at a local dance hall. Donaldson called off the surveillance. It was a mistake. The next morning, the suspect was not to be found at his lodgings in Kemp Street, nor anywhere else in Brighton. Mancini had vanished. Brighton, 1934. Weeks had passed since the first discovery of the body parts in the trunk. But investigators, led by Inspector Robert Donaldson of the Metropolitan Police, were no closer to solving the crime. As an eager press and public waited on news, observers were struck by the similarities between the case and another crime from over a century before. For this was not the first trunk murder in Brighton's history. In 1831, the pregnant Celia Bashford was murdered by her husband, John Holloway. He was a violent bigamist who could not afford another child. He conspired with his second wife, Anne, to murder Celia. Holloway lured her to a house near the beach and strangled her with a rope. Together, John and Anne dismembered the body.
The first thing they did was to cut her arms off, her legs, and her head. And they were taken separately by wheelbarrow down to where Holloway was staying in Margaret Street and pushed them down the Privy. The next day, they decided that they had to get rid of the rest of the body, this dismembered corpse.
The trunk was put into a trunk, in effect. Rather like Mancini, he hired a wheelbarrow to take her to another spot, which was called Lover's Lane, and buried it in a shallow grave with items of clothing, which in fact was his undoing.
Two men were walking through a local park and they saw a piece of red cloth on the ground, and one of them poked it with a stick, and they found body parts. A lot of people turned up to see what was going on. We don't know what the identification was, but one of the women in the crowd said, "That's my sister."
That, together with gossip, because Brighton was a very small place in those days, pointed the finger at John Holloway, who was arrested. He told various stories, which none of which were true, and he was duly convicted.
Holloway's wife, Anne, soon confessed. He was tried and found guilty. He hanged on the 21st of December, 1831. There was no such easy resolution for police in 1934, however. Almost a month had passed since the beginning of the investigation, but the victim found in the luggage remained nameless, as did her killer. One suspect had been identified, a Londoner who went by the name of Tony Mancini. He had aroused suspicion by giving away women's clothing. His girlfriend Violet had not been seen for weeks. It seemed promising, but police were soon disappointed. Their inquiry showed that Violet was too old to be the woman in the luggage, and Mancini had been at work on the days the trunks were deposited at Brighton and London. It was another dead end. On the morning of the 16th of July, however, a man came into Brighton police station with new information. His name was George Barnard. He was Mancini's landlord. He told police that Mancini had suddenly vanished.
This is Donaldson. Don't tell me, Sergeant, he's done a runner. What?
Donaldson soon learned that Mancini had due cause to disappear. He had left behind many of his belongings, and among them was a large black trunk.
Mr. Mancini?
Inside, he could see evidence of a skull and head hair, and he thought he'd found the missing skull of the remains that were found at Brighton Station and King's Cross. But looking a little more deeply at the situation, realised, of course, that it was a whole body.
And the mothballs that he'd put around the corpse had had no effect. The stench was absolutely awful.
When they actually found the trunk with Violet Kay's body in it, it was, of course, a great surprise to the police because they all of a sudden had too many legs for it not to be two bodies. They did have some difficulty working out the identities.
Sergeant?
At 11:40 this morning, Sergeant Scales and I attended the lodgings of Cecil...
Just call him Mancini.
Mancini was absent, believed absconded. In the flat, we found a large black trunk. It contained the body of a woman. We believe this to be Violet Kay, one of the women we've been tracing. A post-mortem will be carried out this evening by Sir Bernard Spilsbury, but it was obvious that the body had been in the trunk for some weeks.
At 5 p.m. that evening, Sir Bernard Spilsbury examined the body of Violet Kay at Brighton mortuary. The still-dressed body was damp with decay, rotting green, red and brown. It had been in the trunk for weeks. Despite this advanced state of decomposition, Spilsbury was still able to tell police that Violet had been killed by a powerful blow to the side of her head. Alerts were sent out to police forces across the country. Mancini had to be found.
Spilsbury found the body of Violet not unnaturally badly decomposed after all these weeks, but he was able to detect a depressed fracture above her right ear, which he thought was the primary cause of death.
A blow to the head had dislodged a small piece of skull. Now, when Violet's body was found, there had been a hammer and some coal. This could quite possibly have caused the wound.
Spilsbury also found, and his evidence is controversial here, that bruising to the head would have been inflicted 2 or 3 minutes before death.
Bernard Spilsbury said that it was certainly a murder and it couldn't have been an accident. And so the police were on the lookout for Mancini.
So, statements from the men who were with Mancini last night.
Right. What did they have to say?
They were with Mancini in the club after our men...
After I called them off, yes.
They accompanied Mancini to his lodgings in Kemp Street. Noticed the smell, of course. Then they all went for breakfast. They described Mancini as carefree.
Well, at least somebody is. Anything else?
After breakfast, they went to Preston Park Station, where Mancini boarded the 7 a.m. train to London Victoria.
Really? Victoria?
I've passed it on to the yard.
Good work, Sergeant. They'll find him.
Apparently, his last words to his friends were, "I'll be famous soon."
I'll be famous soon. Well, Sergeant, it's not disappointing.
But if Mancini had killed Violet, then what was his motive? Their relationship was a stormy one. Mancini was a womanizer, and Violet was easily provoked. Witnesses remembered a confrontation between the pair in early May. Violet was angry at Mancini for flirting with a young waitress at the cafe where he worked. Violet was never seen there again, nor was she seen by anyone else. On the 11th of May, Violet's sister in London received a poorly spelt telegram. It claimed to be from Violet. She was going away, it said. Her sister heard nothing more. Weeks later, Mancini was heard to boast of beating his girlfriend from pillar to post with a hammer.
The message said, "Gone away, gone abroad, sailing today, will write." The police got the original note, which had been handed in at the post office, and this matched up to Mancini's handwriting on the menus that he'd written at the Skylark Cafe.
And then he said, about women, you know, there's only one way to treat them. Don't use your fists, because you'll only hurt yourself. Use a hammer, as I did, and slosh them with it. A very strange thing to say for a man who hasn't been accused of murder, or even to be saying that kind of thing in case he shouldn't. But Mancini is a fairly unintelligent man, a man not capable of planning.
Sure enough, during searches at the flat where Mancini and Violet had lived, police found a charred metal hammerhead among the ashes of the fire. Its handle had been burned away as if someone had tried to destroy it. Whoever that somebody was seemed to do enough, for forensic techniques were rudimentary in the 1930s, and the burning of the hammer had removed anything which could link it to the murder. Despite all evidence being circumstantial, everything was pointing to Mancini. Donaldson and his team needed a confession, but in order to obtain one, they needed to track down the elusive Mancini. Having left his home in Brighton, Tony Mancini had fled to London, leaving behind most of his belongings, including a large black trunk containing the rotting body of his girlfriend, Violet Kay. The police were working around the clock to find him, and early on the 17th of July, Donaldson received the news he'd been waiting for. Mancini had been found and arrested. He had enjoyed his 2 days of freedom. He'd gone drinking with friends and even took the time to seduce a 17-year-old girl. Now, however, Mancini faced a far less pleasant encounter.
You say she was already dead when you found her?
Yeah. She was laying on the bed. Blood all over the sheets and everywhere.
Why did you not call the police?
I don't know. I was frightened. I couldn't prove I didn't do it, and I knew you'd blame me.
And that's when you bought the trunk?
Yeah.
And decided to take her with you when you moved to Kemp Street? You have no idea who might have killed her?
As God is my judge. I don't know. Well, she was a prostitute, you see. There was always men coming up to the house, all the hours. You ask my landlord, he'll tell you.
You are suggesting that one of these men, her clients, killed her?
Well, you hear about it, don't you? All I know is that I'm innocent. Except the fact I kept the body. I admit that. I should have gone to the police when I found her, but that's all I'd done. I never killed her.
They were sure of Mancini's guilt, but had no solid proof, and it was clear that a confession was out of the question. Despite this, they were convinced they had enough to satisfy a jury in a court of law.
A trunk containing a woman's body was found in a room which you occupied at 52 Kemp Street, Brighton. As a result of our inquiries, you are now to be charged with her murder. You are not obliged to say anything unless you wish to do so. But anything you do say will be taken down in writing and may be given in evidence. Is that understood?
I'll say it again. I'm not guilty.
Mancini's trial began at 10:30 on the 11th of December 1934. As always with such notorious cases, a large crowd had gathered outside the courthouse. A ballot was required to distribute the tickets for the public gallery. Following Mancini's plea of not guilty, the prosecution began. They told the jury that Mancini had killed Violet Kay, that he had stuffed her body, first into a cupboard and then a trunk, which he transported across Brighton to new accommodation. Suspicions raised by the smell and strange liquid seeping from the trunk were dismissed by Mancini until his police interview and flight from justice. The esteemed K.C. Norman Burkitt was the defense counsel, but even with his experience, he had his work cut out with Mancini.
When Mancini went to court, he was the villain. He was turned into an absolute monster. People booed and shouted and hissed. He was quite a loathsome creature. That Violet was characterized as a drunk, drug addict. She was a prostitute. That was her reputation, such as it was completely shredded.
The defence were very clever in making things more complicated than they needed being, and they did represent Violet Kay to have been jealous of an affair that Mancini might have been having with another waitress.
What Burkitt did very cleverly was to seed in the idea that she could have fallen down the steps into the area outside the basement flat at Park Crescent, had her fractured skull there, got up, tottered into the flat, and eventually undressed and lay down on the bed and died. It sounds, actually, on the face of it, a slightly far-fetched theory, but the way in which it was presented was highly professional, highly competent.
If he hadn't done the murder, all his offence was that he concealed the body. And he'd explained that away to the court by saying, because of his past criminal record, that would have told against him had he admitted to finding the body. And so he concealed the body for that reason. That, it was argued, was his main defence.
Unusually for trials like this, Mancini was called as a witness. It was a gamble. All eyes were on Mancini, but the slick Londoner thrived under the pressure.
Mancini, despite his rather villainous appearance, scarred face and all the rest of it, was actually rather a good witness. The reporter had noted that he was relatively well-spoken, seemed reasonably intelligent, and he seemed to put on rather a good act. The jury certainly were taken in by it. So what, in fact, Mancini was saying was, I'm a man who's got previous convictions. I wouldn't get a fair deal from the police. I know I was acting as a pimp for this woman. I shouldn't have been doing it, but I did it. I'm telling it as it is, and the jury took it.
To the astonishment of the country, they cleared Mancini of murder. He was released at once.
The trial was an extraordinary triumph for the defence. It's a textbook example for young lawyers in how to conduct a defence when all circumstances seem to be riding against you.
Everybody, it seems, thought Mancini had committed a murder, and Mancini had to be smuggled out of the back of the court. And so he was free.
He clearly did love the limelight, and he was a good witness on his own behalf. There's no doubt about that at all. He could attune his message to the circumstances.
Mancini escaped the noose. But what of the original murder? What of the woman found in pieces at Brighton and London? That investigation had continued. A porter at London Bridge Station recalled helping a man travelling to Brighton with a heavy suitcase. It was the 6th of June, the day before the first trunk was left at the station there. The porter remembered the contents of the case shifting with a dull thud as he lifted it. Somehow, it reminded him of meat. The unknown passenger had travelled from Dartford, the porter believed. But despite an exhaustive search there, police could not trace him. A woman then came forward on the 30th of July, 1934. She claimed that the blue writing found on the scrap of packing paper in the first trunk was hers. She worked for a confectionery company in Finsbury Park, London. Sometimes they received faulty stock, which they sent back to the manufacturers. It was this woman's job to wrap up the goods and dispatch them. Using a blue pencil, she would write the address, Meltis Company, Bedford. Once those faulty goods reached Bedford, however, the packing paper was shredded and reused in parcels sent to depots all across the country. Once again, the trail went cold. The killer of the young woman found in pieces at Brighton and King's Cross was never to be found, nor was her identity ever established. Her story remains unknown. The killer of Violet Kay, however, was eventually confirmed. In November 1976, Tony Mancini gave an interview to the News of the World. Finally, after more than 4 decades, the truth emerged. Mancini told the newspaper he had killed Violet. He'd thrown a hammer at her during one of their frequent arguments. Panicking, he'd then hidden the body and lied about Violet's whereabouts. Despite this confession, there was still no justice for Violet. The law said that a man tried and cleared of a crime could not face a jury again for the same offense. Mancini lived to an old age. Brighton would never forget that summer, however, when it was the murder capital of England, the queen of all slaughtering places.